We've got some incredible musicians out here. Great morning to be able to open up and celebrate God like that. Let me ask you this. Have you ever had moments, or maybe vacations, where you have planned things out, but things have not gone the way that you had hoped they would? I know it seems like we've been plagued on our vacations as a family. We've got 3 kids, and we would always go to this place called Holiday World in southern Indiana. And I can remember camping at Holiday World and camping in southern Indiana where there would be so much torrential rain where our tent would be ready to float away. There's other times I can remember where we were on our way to Holiday World, had tickets in hand, and then we found out that our son was actually allergic to amoxicillin and began to break out in hives, and so things kind of took a different direction. We've all had different moments when that happens to us, right? Where things don't go exactly the way that we thought would turn out. For me, I think Holiday World, there was something to that where things just didn't turn out the way, and it had something to do with where Holiday World is located. Santa Claus, Indiana. Now, as Chicagoans, we all have received a gift from Santa Claus, Indiana, that has not turned out the way that we thought it would. Jay Cutler, Chicago. Yeah, some things don't always turn out the way. Well, we've all had vacations that don't turn out. Maybe you remember this vacation.
First one's here. First one's here.
But we're so far away, Clark.
Right. And at the end of the day, when the lot's all full and everybody's fighting to get out of here, we'll be the first ones out, too, right? Why? Because we're the Griswolds. Come on, race him.
Sorry, folks, we're closed for 2 weeks to clean and repair America's favorite family fun park. Sorry.
What?
Oh man, I think the most painful part of that entire clip was his shorts. That was just, life doesn't always work out the way that we planned, right? I mean, sometimes we've all experienced this. We're going through life, and then life throws us a curveball. It takes us to a place that we never would have chosen for ourselves. A place that we never would have picked to live our life. Well, in this series, How to Get Through What We're Going Through, what we've been talking about is how do we navigate those challenging seasons of life? How do we actually get through what we're going through? And we've talked about our journey of faith and how there's actually 3 phases of faith. And in the first stage of faith, we call it confident faith. And this is maybe the stage of faith where when we first find our way back to God, everything seems to be going great, right? We're alive, we're on fire, our prayers seem to be answered, and it seems like just joy and gratitude abound. And there's this other side of faith that takes a while to get there. It's called living faith, right? Where no matter what we're going through, it seems like our faith is just rooted and deep and strong, no matter what the circumstance is. And this is where we really want to be. This is where God is calling us, to have a rooted, living faith. And the only way to get from there to here is to get through this. Right? To get through that season of faith that we're calling challenged faith. Where life throws us a curveball. Something goes the way we didn't plan for it to go. And in this season of challenged faith, it seems like God might be a little bit distant. But the only way to get from confident faith in the beginning to a rooted living faith is to get through this season of challenged faith. Now, as we move forward in this series, you might recall, if you've been here for the first couple of weeks, we've been talking about a story in the Old Testament where God chose a guy named Moses to deliver the Israelites from slavery in Egypt and take them into the promised land. And what we discovered is that the way that God chose to do that was to actually take them through a desert. And as they traveled through the desert, they found themselves in a place they didn't expect. They didn't expect to go through a desert. It didn't feel like being rescued. And it was exactly the way that God wanted to take them there. Well, how many of you like to read books and you actually kind of skip forward and read the end of the book? You're like, that annoys me, but my kids do it all the time. I'm like, you can't do that, you ruin the story. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to do that. We're going to flip forward and look at the end of this story. Okay? So, this actually, it takes place, let me bring you up to speed. Moses has been with the Israelites now for 40 years. And they've been traveling through the desert for 40 long years. Now, at the end of this story, this is where we find ourselves. It says this: Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah across from Jericho. And there the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah, as far as the Mediterranean Sea. And then the Lord said to him, "This is the land that I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants." Now imagine with me for a second. You've been traveling 40 years through the wilderness. All kinds of difficult things have happened. And here Moses is finally having an incredible vantage point in the promised land. After all the years of challenge, God's promise is finally coming to fruition. And as he's looking out over this beautiful land, God says this: I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. Now that doesn't seem fair. God brings Moses all the way through the desert. He brings all the people there, and the Israelites don't get to cross into the promised land with their leader. This just doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem fair. I don't like this part of the story. And I would imagine that you don't like this part of the story, or particularly when things like this happen in your life. Now, when you came in, did you receive one of the programs from the people? What I want you to do is this. Go ahead and take this out, because On the inside flap, there is a little space on the back of that flap where you can write some things down. It says, what are you going through? Tell us about your experience. And you can actually make this a prayer request. Think for just a second. What is it that you're going through? Maybe right now. What is challenging your faith right now? Write that down. I'm going to write mine down as well. We're going to hold on to this. Because these are the things that challenge our faith and have an opportunity to really shape us. Now, if we back up in this story for just a little bit, what we discover is that this is not the first time that Moses and the Israelites have been on the brink of entering into the Promised Land. We back up into the story 40 years before. The Israelites are there. They've already had some ups and downs with each other and with God. But now, 40 years early, they are poised and ready to enter into the Promised Land. The Lord said to Moses, right as they're at that point, send some men into the land of Canaan, which I'm giving to the Israelites. And from each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders. So Moses selects 12 of these people to go into the land and spy out the land and really see if what God was promising was about to be fulfilled. So they go in, and for 40 days they explore the land, and then they come back, and they bring figs and pomegranates and grapes and honey, and it's incredible. And when they come back, they give this report. They say, we went into the land that you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here's the fruit. And they bring all this back, and this is incredible, right? What they're seeing is confident faith. It's a beautiful thing that God has offered them. But then the report continues. This is where it turns a little sour. The people who live there are powerful, they said. Their cities are fortified and they're large. We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread amongst the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had explored. And so with that, any trust in God that they had developed just crumbled. And they really began to fall apart. And they actually began to plot a return to Egypt where they had been slaves. And so as that happens, only 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, had actually held strong in their belief and in their faith. And they actually begged and pleaded with the people to trust in God and to not give up, even though this challenge to their faith was threatening to undo them. But the Lord says to Moses here, how long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I've performed among them? See, God forgives them at this point, but as a consequence of their decision to not go into the land, he makes them wander for 40 years in the desert. And only Joshua and Caleb from that generation are allowed to go in. All of the adults from that generation pass away, and the children then of that generation are allowed to go into the Promised Land. And so when I think of Moses, an elderly man, days away from death, sitting on top of that mountain, after all that he had to go through, it just didn't seem fair that he would have to go through this. And what bothers me about this story is that it makes me have to sit with this question. What if my suffering doesn't go away? What if my pain I'm never delivered from? What if I never receive what I've hoped for and what I've longed for? What if I never get to experience the fulfillment of what I've dreamed? That's painful. Those questions haunt us because without being delivered from our pain, without a resolution, without a payoff, we're left answering, why? Why do I have to endure this? Why do I have to go through this? And sure, sometimes we suffer, right? As a result of our bad decisions. Sometimes we do bad things and we have to suffer the consequences of those things. And we've all done that, right? We've made bad decisions and we've got to eat the fruit that comes from it. But then there's other times when we have to endure difficult situations because of the decisions of other people. Maybe it's a parent who walked out on our family. Or maybe it's some really bad financial advice that led us to a terrible place. Maybe it's a child who makes decisions that really break our heart. And, sometimes it's decisions that we can identify, but then there are moments of loss and pain that we go through that there is really no explainable answer for. And there is no way to really provide a sufficient answer to the question of why we have to suffer. I mean, good-meaning people, good-intentioned friends maybe try to come alongside and encourage us, right? But if you've ever had to sit with unimaginable pain, it doesn't matter what people say, it just seems like the question of why is always bigger than the answers that are provided. Right? Well, I want to level with you that this morning I'm not going to be able to answer the why question of suffering. We're not going to be able to give a sufficient reason for that. But there is another question. And many of you know that this other question is just as important during these seasons of suffering as that why question. And it's the question of how. How do I get through what I'm going through? How many of you are familiar with a man named Viktor Frankl? You ever heard that name? Name rings a bell? Well, he said something that is worth considering on this topic. And before I get into what he said, I want to tell you a little bit about his story so that you understand the context. Viktor Frankl was a renowned Austrian psychiatrist, sorry. And he wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. And the reason why this book is so powerful is not just because it outlines his theories on psychology and what he believes about suffering, but because it chronicles the actual events of his life. In 1944, he and his wife and his mother and father were arrested by Nazi soldiers and taken to Auschwitz concentration camp. And he tells the story of being in Auschwitz and then 3 other concentration camps before he was finally delivered after the war. They endured incredible beatings, just starvation, emotional torture. This is a guy who held his father in his arms as his father passed away. Afterwards, he found out that his mother had also passed away in the concentration camp, and his wife, who'd been transferred to another camp, he never knew, but she had also died. This kind of catastrophic loss is just unthinkable. And there will never be a good enough answer to the question of why that had to happen. But through this experience of suffering, what he discovered is that there was one thing that could never be taken from a person, even in the midst of this incredible suffering. And what he says is this. He says, we who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but the last thing, which is human freedom to choose your attitude in any given set of circumstances. He goes on to explain, suffering in and of itself is meaningless. We give our suffering meaning by the way that we respond to it. Forces beyond our control can take everything you possess except for one thing, your freedom to choose how you respond to the situation. You can't control what happens to you in your life, but you can always control what you'll feel and do about what happens to you. Suffering is in and of itself meaningless. And we've got to hold on to that, right? And let go of trying to answer that why question. But we can, there is hope, all right? We can give meaning to our suffering by the way in which we respond to it. We can actually develop a living faith by how we respond. Now, I'm not really sure what you're going through, what you wrote down on your piece of paper. I know some in here are suffering physical tragedies right now that are so hard to get through. Others are experiencing the pain of broken relationships or the sting that comes from making bad decisions. Well, we are all over the map as a group here. But let me offer a couple of words of encouragement that can help us develop a living faith as we're dealing with these things. Think about this. We all, when the circumstances are right, we actually embrace challenges, don't we? We can choose to embrace certain challenges. Think about this. How many of you have ever run a marathon? Around the room. I'm always amazed at how many people in here have run a marathon. Any more than one is incredible. So, but when you run a marathon, or when you go on an extended diet, or you do something like that, you're embracing the challenge because you know that it's going to transform you for the better, right? And I think of those who train for marathons or races or other kinds of workout programs. They go, all the diet, the sacrifice of time with their friends and their family, just to go through so that they can be transformed in a way, right? And so we actually embrace challenge because we know that it can have a positive transformation on our life. Well, here's something interesting. The challenges that we don't invite into our life can actually transform us in the same way, for the better. In her book, Learning to Walk in the Dark, author Barbara Brown Taylor says this: "I have learned things in the dark that I could have never learned in the light. Things that have saved my life over and over again, so that there is really only one logical conclusion. I need darkness as much as I need light." See, this has the ability, these tough times have the ability to teach us things that we could never learn otherwise. And there is an opportunity, as painful as it may be, where we can reach out to God and actually ask God to teach us during this season of struggle. And it takes courage to dig down deep, to get to that place. But we've got to remember that we are not alone in this season of challenged faith. If we'll allow God to transform us, it can have an incredible impact. Second thing that we can choose is this, is that we can let suffering remind us of the bigger story. We can let suffering remind us that we are part of a bigger story. Now think back to Moses. Was Moses a failure because he didn't go into the promised land? No, he was not a failure. He was not perfect. How many of you are perfect? Okay, that was a quick survey, right? Nobody's perfect, including Moses. But here's the deal. As Moses passes away on the doorstep of the promised land, this is what's written about him. "Since then, no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all these signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to the Pharaoh, to all of his officials, and in the whole land. No one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all of Israel. And to this day, Moses is remembered as one of the greatest biblical heroes." But he never got to go into the promised land. Understand, his life, this season of challenge, was part of a much bigger story. When I think of somebody who has lived this out in my own life that I know, I think of my mother-in-law, who 30 years ago was told that she had 3 months to live. She was 30 years old. My wife was a second grader at the time. Her little brother was just a preschooler. She had a rapidly advancing cancer, and the outlook was bleak. And so immediately there was an outpouring of support. Friends and family who showed up at the hospital and just packed her room to encourage her, to help her get through what she was going through. It was kind of like a party at the hospital with this terminal diagnosis. And one of the nurses was actually really concerned. And a couple of evenings later, she came in and had a private conversation with Angie and said, I don't think you know what you have, what the diagnosis is. You're going to die in 3 months. And Angie's like, I know full well what's going to happen to me. I know that I'm dying. And she's like, how can you have peace? How can you smile when your kids are in the room? And at that moment, Angie had an opportunity to share about the most powerful source of hope in all of the universe. The comfort of Jesus and the comfort that comes from having hope in him. It's incredible when we think of some of the difficult times in life Here's Angie, faced with this decision that the doctors gave her. She could allow the cancer to take her life in 3 months, or she could undergo a surgery and a procedure that was, at the time, incredibly risky. And if it didn't succeed, she would die immediately. It was a bone marrow transplant. And if she would make it through this, the rest of her life, she would have to struggle with what's called graft versus host, and her body having to deal with this painful, challenge in life. And she chose to take that so that she could embrace life. And now, just yesterday, actually, we celebrated 30 years of her. And as far as we know, she's the longest living survivor of somebody who's had a bone marrow transplant for multiple myeloma cancer. Not only has she held on to Jesus her entire life since, but she's been able to hold on to her grandkids. She's been able to hold on to the hope that God gave her. Because there was real comfort that she found during that time of challenge, and things that she has learned that some of us may never learn. I don't know what you're going through today. I don't know what challenges you're facing, but I do know this, that many of us are on that desert road, that it seems long and we need hope. But I also know this, there is one who walks beside you, who holds your hand every step of the way, and who gives us comfort. There is good news that in the midst of our struggle, there's hope, that we're not alone, that we can make it through, and when we make it through, we will be transformed into the image of Christ. And it will have a positive impact, not only on us, but for those around us, if we will choose to allow God to shape us in the midst of it. Sometimes it's when people see Christ the most, when we suffer the most. If anyone understands suffering, it's Jesus. God allowed him to go to the cross and endure incredible torture, not just physically, but emotionally, as he experienced betrayal, and those who were closest to him turning their backs on him. But he did it, and the Bible says this, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God. In the middle of his suffering, Jesus set his heart on the larger story and what it would mean for you and I. We can do the same. There may never be a good answer to the question of why we suffer, but if we'll lean into God, we will be able to get through what we're going through. Let's pray.